Hi, thank you all so much. I've never had an intro like that, and it means a lot. I'm so grateful to be here. Being from a small NGO in a little sleepy border town in southern Arizona, we don't get a lot of opportunities to get fancy speaking engagements like this, so it really means a lot. I'm sure you're all familiar with the refugee crisis happening in the Mediterranean right now. And I'm sure most of you saw the heartbreaking image of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi lying face down on a Turkish beach after drowning when the boat carrying his mother, brother, and father capsized. I've read that this image has, quote, galvanized public attention, that finally people are starting to demand action around what's happening in the Mediterranean. I've seen friends of mine compelled to care about the Syrian refugee crisis for the first time, sharing articles on social media and expressing outrage and sadness at this humanitarian crisis. The White House released a statement claiming that, quote, Europe should crack down on traffickers who are exploiting migrants and ensure that migrants' human rights are protected, end quote. Aid efforts have increased, new fundraisers launched, and refugee quotas expanded in many nations. These are all really positive developments, important steps forward. I hope that these developments save lives, and yet I don't buy it. I don't buy it because, like my colleagues, I've been involved in a different but deeply similar refugee crisis happening right here in the United States. I don't buy it because it rings of dishonesty, and I don't buy it because I know by now the 24-hour news cycle has a limit when it comes to compassion. What if I told you that where I live in southern Arizona, we have had the equivalent of a small plane crash every year, around 160 to 170 dead bodies for the past 15 years? These people are also refugees, fleeing violence and insecurity. As a nation, as people of conviction, we are failing to connect the refugee crisis that's happening here on our border to what is happening in the Mediterranean. We are failing because we are practicing what the musician Immortal Technique calls salad bar activism. It's this idea that we can pick and choose issues to care about, and we can isolate these issues from one another, because to look at the bigger picture might be too devastating. To recognize that income inequality and war and global warming and globalization and militarization and gang violence and border policing strategies and racism are just a few of the factors leading to the death of people in the deserts and the oceans of the world. To recognize that feels overwhelming and paralyzing. To call ourselves to a higher standard when it comes to the compassion, or when it comes to showing compassion for the Mediterranean crisis, and that on the U.S. Mexico border, demands more compassion than we have ever given, a kind of radical compassion that I think everyone in this room is capable of exhibiting. Let's back up. I know I had an intro, but to orient myself, my name is Chelsea, and I'm a founding member of the Colibrí Center for Human Rights. We're based in Tucson, and we're a family advocacy organization that's located inside of a morgue. To be specific, we're located within the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. We take missing persons reports that are forensically relevant for folks last seen crossing the U.S. Mexico border, and we conduct comparisons between this information and that of the unidentified dead. And we conduct comparisons, this means that we are constantly involved in the business of death. We talk to families of missing migrants every single day. We collect all of the information we can about the disappeared person. Then we begin to search the bodies. We look at personal effects, at tattoos and broken bones and other abnormalities. We do comparisons. Sometimes we get lucky. We help make an identification. We find someone's missing loved one among the immeasurable mass of suffering surrounding the unidentified dead. We know at Colibrí the reality of our border. We know that more than 6,000 individual, irreplaceable human lives have been lost. We have seen the news cycles come and go, the intermittent upticks in interest surrounding our work. We've also seen how public compassion has begun to wane as the crisis of death and suffering continues, but we cannot stop our work. That's because we know it matters, even if the government and the news and the public have forgotten that. We know because we've held the bones of children like Alan Kurdi in our hands. How, as first responders to the disaster of death and disappearance on the border, do we communicate to a public how much this matters, how devastating it is? I want all of you to close your eyes. Really, close your eyes. Settle into the darkness of your eyelids and listen to my words. Think of your life. Not your real life, not your actual physical life of being here and being present at the Clinton School of Public Service, listening to some person blabber on about a topic that she's supposed to know something about. Think instead of your life as a human being, and if you can, conceive of a different reality. Imagine, if you will, what your life might be like if you lived in Honduras, the murder capital of the world, or El Salvador, where gangs run the country, or Guatemala, where the president just stepped down because of corruption, or even Syria, where violence and insecurity is causing the largest migrant influx to Europe since World War II. Imagine having children in this reality. Imagine losing loved ones to brutal violence. Imagine, if you can, the isolation, the fear, the panic. Keep your eyes closed. Now imagine that you find a way out. Not for you, but for the person you care about most. Who is most special to you? All of you, take a moment to visualize this person. Imagine all of their perfect, undeniable flaws, their features, their smile, their voice. Imagine that you work for years to save the money to send this person to the U.S. or to Europe or somewhere that isn't consumed by the hot flames of war and violence. Perhaps to the U.S., where you know they will have a second chance at life, at success, at health, love, and happiness. To the U.S., where they won't be plagued by gangs and guns and rape and violence. Now imagine, after all of that saving and striving and hoping, that your person disappears. They don't die, but nor do they survive. They go missing in the Sonoran Desert or the Mediterranean Sea. They vanish like so many flowers at the end of springtime. You don't know the truth. You don't know if they're alive or dead. And you can never know until you encounter real proof, the kind that's made of bodies and DNA and death certificates. Now open your eyes. Recognize, if you will, that no amount of imagining will connect us with the reality of these places unless you yourself are a migrant in the midst of this chaos, unless you are someone who has had to face the impossible choice of placing their child on top of a train or on a tiny, faulty boat in the water in order to have a better life. As the poet Warsan Shire writes, you have to understand, no one would put their children in a boat unless the water was safer than the land. This exercise in empathy that we just did, closing our eyes and trying to imagine what we might do, I wish I could do this exercise with the politicians who pass anti-immigrant legislation and continue to militarize the world's borders. Because I know, as I hope you do, that the policies concerning migrants and their families are more than political wins or losses. They are more than abstract concepts and sterile statistics. Laws and policies affecting migrants, their communities, and their families are very real, and they have life and death consequences. In some ways, it's very ironic that I'm here speaking to you at the Clinton School of Public Service. This school carries the name of former President Bill Clinton, yet so do some of the harshest border militarization policies that helped create this humanitarian disaster on the U.S. Mexico border. In 1994, the Clinton administration initiated what is now called prevention through deterrence style enforcement. It's this idea that by concentrating enforcement in the urban ports of entry along the border, places where people had been safely crossing for generations, you would reduce undocumented migration. Unfortunately, all this policy achieved was the funneling of undocumented crossers into more remote, isolated, and dangerous parts of the border, where they have been dying painful, solitary deaths ever since. The Clinton administration ignored the fact that at exactly the same time they were rolling out prevention through deterrence strategy, NAFTA was beginning its devastation of the Mexican agricultural economy. The result were thousands of desperate people, their livelihoods destroyed by U.S. foreign policy, coming to the border to find that if they wanted to cross, their only choice would be to do so in the remote desert where they risk death from dehydration. In short, this is an enforcement strategy built on human suffering, and it's something we've seen replicated in borders across the globe. It is interesting how we conceive of other borders as brutal when in fact ours is one of the deadliest the world has ever seen. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany, and the occasion was marked by festivals and celebrations. President Obama was in Germany in 2013, and while there he said that, quote, "No wall can stand against the yearnings for justice, the yearnings for freedom, the yearnings for peace that burn in the human heart," end quote. Germany's wall stood for 28 years, yet to give some perspective, ours has only stood for 12, and has so far been 40 times more deadly than the Berlin Wall was during its entire tenure. In fact, more people have died trying to cross the U.S. Mexico border than in Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 combined. Humor me. Imagine with me again. Imagine that, like me and my colleagues, you work on the border. The goal of your work is to find someone's missing son, and then you do. You manage to separate his body from the hundreds of unidentified dead, and you are triumphant in your discovery, in your restoration of humanity. That is, until you realize that you have to tell his mother, until you realize that you're 23 years old and you're not prepared to tell someone their only son is dead. I don't work at Colibrí because I'm best suited for the job. I don't have a master's in public service like you all. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I constantly feel myself an imposter in this work. This isn't self-deprecation. This is me knowing that the families I serve deserve more. They deserve better. The truth is, we have a massive humanitarian crisis on the U.S. side of the U.S. Mexico border, and as the first responders to this crisis, we are just the ones who showed up. We're not exceptional. We're certainly not the best positioned to do this work. The difference is, we showed up. We come and we get our hands dirty on a daily basis, and we do it because we abide by a code. I'm not religious, but it's undeniable that our work at Colibrí follows a spiritual orientation, an undeniable direction of purpose. The closest thing that I've encountered that begins to describe where and why and how we do what we do is the concept of unconditional hospitality. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's an idea that was first described by the philosopher Zack. It's the idea that a deeply human welcome is extended to, quote, whomever turns up, before any determination, before any anticipation, before any identification, whether or not it has to do with a foreigner, an immigrant, an uninvited guest, or an unexpected visitor, whether or not the new arrival is a citizen of another country, a human, an animal, a divine creature, a living or dead thing, male or female. I think this idea of unconditional hospitality is the answer for how we need to move forward regarding the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean and here in the United States, but also all over the globe, from the Bay of Bengal to Australia. It's an act of radical resistance, of unrestricted compassion. The Greek word for hospitality is, bear with me, philoxenia, literally the love of strangers. So join us. Join Colibrí in our radical, unconditional hospitality. Do not allow yourself to see the world's tragedies in isolation from one another. Don't practice salad bar activism. Don't allow compassion fatigue. Don't buy into the 24-hour news cycle. Unconditional hospitality is rare. It's so rare, in fact, that Derrida called it a miracle when it happens. Each of you can care deeply for the Allens of the world and recognize that there are ways that you can help if you're willing to get your hands dirty. As the Talmud states, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Right over here.
Hi, my name is Stacy Cox, and I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. And first, I just want to say, bear down, Wildcats. And the second thing, or my question is, what type of interactions does your organization have with the Border Patrol and also border communities, Douglas, Nogales, Agua Prieta, et cetera?
Yeah. So I speak to Border Patrol probably on a daily basis. We need to work alongside them for things like fingerprints. A lot of the folks that have died have been previously apprehended, so it's actually a method of identification oftentimes to take fingerprints from the deceased individual and do a comparison with the records that Border Patrol has. And yeah, it's been really great collaborating with them. I think as activists, it's easy to dehumanize Border Patrol. I see a lot of my colleagues do it, and it's really takes a lot of intentional effort not to do so, and to remember that we're all people doing our best, But yeah, in terms of border communities, folks are dying all over, not in the urbanized areas that you mentioned, like Douglas, but in the surrounding areas for sure. So everyone on the border is impacted by this. And in terms of working directly with the community, there's not a lot that we do in terms of going to those communities and speaking to people. We're more focused on just trying to get folks identified. But I can say that it's really undeniable that people are really impacted. Hope that answered your question. Bear down.
Anybody else? Yes, right here.
So 2 questions. First, about how often do you make a positive identification, either like what percentage of the remains that you identify, or how frequently, daily, weekly, monthly? And then my next question is, how frequently do you cross the border into Mexico I'm assuming you're in Nogales, U.S., and how often do you cross into Nogales, Mexico, and other surrounding areas?
So in terms of the identification rate, it's we've made over 100 identifications since our founding. We don't have exact numbers. It's something we're working on because if you can imagine, there's varying levels of involvement with a case. So in some cases, we're directly responsible for the ID. It wouldn't have happened without us. In others, maybe we noticed something and we worked alongside the forensic scientists to kind of suggest a match, but maybe we didn't, make the match all on our own. So we're still working on those numbers, but it's over 100 at this point. And it's happening with more regularity since we developed our database. So we have the first relational database that's dedicated to the border region. It has all of the information for the missing and unidentified dead. So it can conduct automatic comparisons. So that's really helping. And the other question, so we're actually in Tucson, but as an organization, we don't cross into Mexico. As an individual, I do all the time.
Right, we'll go here first, and then. Oh.
Hi. I want to ask what radical compassion would look like in practice, sort of at the policy level. So if you could start all over again, what would you do as a matter of policy?
Yeah, you have the easy question, don't you? Well, I think it begins more with an orientation of the spirit, and that policy will probably follow. And I guess the orientation that I would advocate for would be one that's centered on human rights, that puts human life at the center of border policy, whereas in the past we saw, kind of this fear-based approach to the border that really hasn't stopped the importation of drugs, has actually forced the cartels to become more sophisticated and involved with human smuggling, whereas they were not in the past. I think creating more just policy starts with questioning the policy that's on the ground. And unfortunately, it's taboo right now to talk about demilitarizing the border. So I think what we need to begin with is questioning, what does border militarization achieve? And in my view, it achieves the needless death of a lot of poor people. So I don't know if that really answered, but.
Right here.
So I guess my question was along the same lines. We were thinking the same thing, but I wonder if you could speak to some of the policies presently in place that have led to militarization. You talked about that a little bit in your lecture yesterday, but I wonder if you could expand upon that, because you touched on it briefly right now.
Yeah, so there was a real shift in 1994. There was a Border Patrol sector chief in El Paso named Sylvester Reyes, and he kind of pioneered this effort to what's become known as prevention through deterrence. What he did is he had a given number of agents, and he realized that he was spreading his men thin across the border. So, he was trying to shut off the entire border, and he kind of reoriented himself to concentrate his men at the safest parts of his sector, so El Paso, where people had been crossing for generations. And by concentrating enforcement there, the apprehensions went through the roof, and then the crossings declined shortly after that because people knew they couldn't cross in that area. So that was then replicated by the Clinton administration. Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego is a major piece of policy, and similar operations along the border were initiated around the same time, mid-1990s to the early 2000s. And they just sort of follow along this idea that you make it impossible to cross where it's safe, and you sort of leave open where it's really dangerous to cross. And the thinking was, it actually says in the 1994 Border Patrol strategic plan that they thought, initially we'll have some deaths in the border, but the word will get out about how dangerous it is, and folks won't cross. So that's kind of a short-sighted way of looking at policy, because like I said, NAFTA was being passed at exactly the same time. So it was underestimating the desperation of the folks coming across, and as a result, we just have a funneling effect into the most isolated and remote areas. And it's really interesting because like I said, I speak to Border Patrol on a daily basis, and I've asked them if they believe that the border can be sealed off. And they always laugh when I ask that, because if you've been to the border, it's vast, it's so massive, and there's areas of the border where there is no fence, there's nothing, it's just wilderness. Then there's other areas, the urban areas, where we have 25-foot wall. So I think that the most harmful policies are those that don't take into account human life, and that are kind of built on this idea of putting people in harm's way in order to get them to stop crossing. Yeah, thanks.
In the back.
Hi, Xochitl Delgado Solorzano. I'm a first-year student. You talked about your contact with the Border Patrol. Have y'all had any interactions with the cartels?
That's a funny question. Our executive director said something to me the other day. She was like, well, you've been on the phone with a cartel member. And I was like, really? I have? And she's like, yeah, well, have you ever, called any of the numbers found on bodies, and gotten a weird response? And I was like, yeah, all the time. One of the things we do is, folks will have pieces of paper in their pockets with numbers written down, and overwhelmingly those are the numbers of the coyotes, because they memorize their family's numbers, because oftentimes they get kidnapped and they don't want to have family numbers on their person, because then the kidnappers will call their family and extort them. So it's often, and they'll have nicknames like, Chapin or Tortuga or something. It's not like a real person's name, it's like a nickname. So I've had some awkward phone calls, where it's sort of like, I'm trying to see if they know the deceased person, and I ask questions like, do you know anybody missing on the border? And they're like, I know lots of people on the border, and it's kind of like, oh, okay. But I don't think we've had any significant, interactions with the narcos. That being said, our partners in Mexico, specifically the Argentine forensic anthropology team, they're working on the Ayotzinapa cases of the 43 disappeared students in Guerrero, and they regularly get threats. So there is a certain privilege to doing this sort of work on the U.S. side, because we are shielded in a lot of ways. But at the same time, finding funding for human rights work within the U.S. is extremely difficult. I think we have this idea that we sort of conceive of human rights as something that happens in the Mediterranean or in Africa, not as something that needs defending and protecting here at home.
Hi, my name is Zack. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. I was wondering, are there a significant number of other organizations doing similar work on either side of the border, or motivated by kind of a similar spiritual orientation that you know of? And is there any cooperation or communication between you? You were speaking about one organization, the last answer, but.
Yeah, so there's several organizations that do sort of migrant advocacy all throughout the U.S. and Latin America. We're the only one that I know of that, on the U.S. side, that it works on this forensic piece and the human identification. But yeah, like I said, the Argentine team, they work all throughout Latin America. There's also teams in Guatemala and I believe in Honduras. That were started by a really famous forensic anthropologist. So the work's being done definitely throughout Latin America, and we're sort of the northernmost hub of that.
When you identify someone deceased there along the border, how often is it someone who is Mexican versus how often is it someone who's Guatemalan, Honduran, from somewhere else in Central America, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure you all saw the refugee children crisis last summer. So the way that the train routes work, the northern triangle of Guatemala is oriented along train routes that basically end in southern Texas. So mostly people from Central America tend to cross in Texas. And we do get and an increasing number of Central Americans are showing up, but the vast majority, I think 83% of those that have been identified have been Mexican. Vast majority male between the ages of 25 and 35. So.
Realistically, do you feel that you will work yourself out of a job? And how long is that going to take?
Well, hopefully we can get funding, and then I won't be out of a job before then. Yeah, I mean, really, if any of you have any connections or ideas, I'm not kidding. But I actually was talking with my colleagues about this the other day, in the sense that we were having a funding conversation, and we were like, why is it so hard to get this work supported? And I think a big reason is because people we don't have the same culture of care around death that other cultures might. There's not sort of, the same ceremonies that surround, in a lot of cultures, it's like the body stays in the home for a number of days, it's cleaned, it's taken care of. There's a real separation from, I get really creepy questions about like, what does a body smell like? And do you touch bodies? And I mean, really kind of morbid questions. And I think it's not because people are creepy. I think it's because people have no contact with the dead. People, there's not the same integration of death in our culture. So I think when it comes to getting support and, the idea of like being able to like put ourselves out of business, it's that people don't want to put money behind something that's seen as like a dead issue, But also, I think I don't think that the deaths will stop until we stop the criminalization of migrants, until we stop dehumanizing migrants in everyday life. And I think the challenge for us at Colibrí is to make that connection, to say like, we see these bodies as a result of policy, and this is why anti-immigrant legislation matters so much, is because it results in people losing their lives. But with that being said, if the deaths stopped tomorrow, we'd have easily 10 years of work ahead of us. So I don't see, barring running out of money, I don't see us having, going out of business because of lack of work anytime soon.
Well, Chelsea, thank you so much for coming to the
Thank you
Clinton
all. I'm
School.
really
Aaron, thank you for
grateful.
your help.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate y'all coming out.